guys, and welcome back to Beauty in the Bookcase, where we take a book and we make a look. Today we'll be talking about Chimamanda Ngozi Adiche's Americanah, an award-winning novel about race, immigration, mental health, and relationships. Adiche is actually a Nigerian author whose work has been recognized by the New York Times, the Orange Prize, and many other organizations. Americanah revolves around the main character Ifemelu, who is a native to Nigeria, as well as our author. So it starts off focusing on her relationship with this young Nigerian boy named Obinze. So they meet in secondary school, and their romantic relationship starts from there until she actually gets the opportunity to come to the United States to study. And so they are separated for a long time, about 13 years that she spends in the US while he was for some time in London, but mostly in Nigeria. During her first few months in America, Ifemelu continues bonding with her favorite aunt, Auntie Uju, and also her nephew, Dike. The majority of her time in America is spent facing issues with relationships, race, and mental health. After years of struggling, Ifemelu actually manages to start a very successful blog about race and the experiences of a non-American white, and basically just their perception of America, mostly in racial topics. However, Ifemelu ends up deciding that she wants to move back to Nigeria, which of course leads to her shutting down her blog and finally reuniting with Obinze. Problem is, he is actually married now. So that of course adds a bit of a complication to the idea of them retaking their relationship. Furthermore, she also starts working for a magazine, but she promptly ends up leaving it because it wasn't, she wanted to talk about things that actually mattered. So she decides to then start a different blog in which she talks about issues affecting Nigeria and just sort of like what life is like being both native to Nigeria but also returning from America. So of course, race plays a crucial role in the plot of this novel, especially race as a non-American. And I really found myself relating to her experience, Ifemelu's experience of race in America, because really America has a very different way of viewing race as opposed to the rest of the world. And that's not to say that there isn't racism in other places, but there's a more of a hierarchy as she explains it, as well as, you know, there's levels and degrees of whiteness that intermix in what is socially acceptable, I guess. You know, Ifemelu hadn't really had to think too much about race until she comes to America, and I definitely related to that as somebody who essentially was considered white until I came to the States, and then, you know, it sort of dawned on me that in America there's, well, as they put it in, you know, forms and everything, there's non-Hispanic whites and then Hispanic whites, and that's a different category. In Ifemelu's case, she kind of struggles because she doesn't really fit in with white people, but she also kind of struggles sometimes connecting with other Africans and the African American community. So she kind of is displaced wherever she goes. So yeah, so she becomes really fascinated with the idea of race in America, so much so that it becomes the central topic for her blog. And one of the things that she talked about and that I related to as well, and one of the things that she talks about that really stuck out to me and that seemed to be a really relevant point, you know, I mean, I say in today as if the book wasn't, you know, recent. It's recent, but what I mean is it's something that I see debated a lot. And I was actually having a conversation with somebody about this earlier this week. So it stood out to me even more. So she talks a lot about her hair. So when she first leaves Africa, I think she had like braids, and then, you know, she kept her hair in braids for a long time until she meets this guy, Kurt, and he gets her a job at a fancy schmancy place. But then she is kind of forced to start relaxing her hair using relaxer, which of course, from what I've seen, is incredibly painful, and it's obviously not very good for your hair. And even, you know, it can even leave chemical burns, which obviously does not sound fun. Why would you want to do that? But she's kind of forced to constantly be relaxing her hair to be considered appropriate or professional at work. And it takes her a long time to sort of be able to go back to her natural hair. So she ends up, of course, because of all of the damage and stuff, she ends up having to shave her head off because she was losing her hair because of the relaxer. So she ends up having to shave her head, and she has a very hard time sort of like accepting her afro and sort of coming to terms with this new identity, because she spent so long feeling like, I need to be this way, that having to go back to embracing her natural hair was very jarring. But you know, I was fascinated by this because I know that it's very much a real issue for people with curly and kinky hair, or people who have braids or twists, or, you know, those type of protective styles, where their hair is often considered unprofessional. So this was very interesting commentary to sort of be brought into the story. You know, Ifemelu had studied a lot. She was incredibly intelligent. She was definitely somebody of merit, yet still her goals and her achievements were sort of overlooked because of her hair, unless she used relaxer. And, you know, one of the arguments that I've heard against sort of, you know, again, protective hairstyles or just naturally curlier or kinky hair is, you know, people will be like, well, you know, you need to have a standard of professionalism in the office. Absolutely, I don't disagree with that. However, I don't see how braids or curls are unprofessional or inappropriate, you know? Like, for example, I used to have blue hair. I loved having blue hair. But, you know, with the current job I'm in, I can't have blue hair because, you know, it's unprofessional. And yeah, I mean, I think it's ridiculous to consider hair unprofessional in general, but I understand where they're coming from. And while I don't think it affects my performance, I can understand that, you know, having blue hair is a choice. On the other hand, people, you know, with curly, kinky hair, you know, it's not like you get to choose your hair texture, you know? And it's absolutely absurd to be like, oh, you have to style your hair a certain way. You have to basically shove a bunch of chemicals and burn your hair for the sake of work, or you can't work here. But like, that's their hair, you know? You wouldn't tell somebody else like, oh, you can't, I don't know, you wouldn't normally, aside from like maybe odd haircuts, you wouldn't normally tell an employee that they can't just wear their hair as it is. So it's absolutely unfair and ridiculous to be like, yeah, no, your hair is not professional enough, because I mean, it's hair. It's, as somebody who grew up in a country and a culture where all type of curls were considered what they call bad hair, and, you know, as somebody who has spent a lot of time sort of being like, oh, if I have a job interview or I have an important event, I need to straighten my hair because that's professional and that's attractive. It's ridiculous seeing, you know, people make comments over here, because it kind of pushes a narrative and causes a lot of stigma and sort of trauma and self-esteem issues for people. And, you know, Ifemelu comments on the book, you know, she's like, well, you know, you have these these great Black women that are admired by everyone, like Michelle Obama or Beyonce, but when do we ever see them with their natural hair? And again, it's just absurd to be like, well, you have to either use relaxers or like, you know, use a wig or a weave or something, when it's just their natural hair. Like, you can't really do much about the hair that grows out of your head, and it's just unfair to expect somebody to go through that much extra effort for a job over something that doesn't really matter. So yeah, well, there's a lot of racial aspects within the novel that I could go on and on about. This one in particular I really wanted to mention because I've seen so many people struggle with their curls. I myself struggle with them, and just that idea of what if, you know, successful, powerful women started embracing their natural hair. That would have such a huge impact on the way that society perceives, you know, curls and twists and braids. And I think it would also just mean a lot to young girls to be able to see somebody who is considered intelligent and powerful and professional and beautiful and talented not have to have straight hair or, you know, salon made curls and stuff like that. Now, another topic that really stood out to me in this novel, and that I think Adiche handled really, really interestingly, was the topic of mental health, particularly depression. So I'm going to be looking at this from the perspective of both Ifemelu and Dike. So when Ifemelu first arrives in America, she is staying with her auntie Uju for a while, and of course Dike. And you know, it's a bit easier, the transition is, because at least she has family, she has some type of support, right? But then once she starts in college, things start to get a little harder, and you know, she has these roommates who don't really interact with her, and she is having a hard time because with her student visa, she can't work. So she's having a hard time sort of navigating, finding a job, and just dealing with financial struggles and all that, because obviously, you know, as an immigrant, a lot of them come to America or whatever country they go to because, you know, they're going to be the main provider. So you don't want to be coming to America unable to get a job and then having to ask your family for money when it's, you know, supposed to be the other way around. You're supposed to be trying to support them. So she has a very hard time, and she ends up kind of falling prey to this nasty guy who just took advantage of vulnerable girls who just needed money for whatever reason that they needed it. And it's very traumatic for her, and it's dark, and it kind of makes her isolate herself from everyone, her family, her friends, everyone. And the only people really around her are her roommates, who make no effort to talk to her, no effort to understand the situation that she's going in. And I totally understand, you know, of course, if you're living somewhere, you're going to be responsible for rent. But I understood that feeling of living with people who don't really like include you, and not having family, not having friends around. It's really tough. It's really, really hard, and you don't want to talk to anyone because you don't want to worry them, right? You don't want to be like, yeah, things are really hard, because more than likely, you know, people will be like, well, maybe you should come home. But then you're like, well, no, I need to be here to help our situation. So yeah, she has a really hard time, and I really, really identified with that. But what's interesting is that she mentions something that I have heard other non-white or non-European people say, which is that mental health, especially things like depression or anxiety, just aren't a thing in their families, right? And it's like, that's a white people thing. That's not a thing that we do. We don't talk about it. We don't go to therapy. Like, people in my culture don't go to therapy. And it's true. I mean, there's a colossal amount of stigma still surrounding mental health. And it's hard because I understand why realistically we wouldn't see her going to a doctor, taking her meds and all that. But it's also really sad to see her going through all these things by herself, having to experience race for the first time, racism for the first time, being so far from home and having no support, and just having her kind of reject that this is her reality, and kind of dismissing anyone who's like, hey, maybe you're depressed, as just, you know, just being too Americanized to sort of understand what's really going on, I guess. We see her depression improve, right? But there's still things like her just constant self-sabotaging and other behaviors that, you know, stick out, and you're like, you should probably talk to somebody about that. But, you know, I understand that there's a lot going on in this novel, and the point wasn't, you know, it wasn't a mental health novel. It's much more of a race novel. So, you know, you can't spend that much time and sort of like a plot point after it's served its point. And I think, you know, the point that Adiche was trying to make is just, you know, it's very easy to be dismissive or to struggle to understand why immigrants have such a hard time adapting. But a big part of it is, you know, when you don't have that support system, and when everything around you is so different, and, you know, you don't have anybody to talk to, you don't have any friends, you're constantly facing obstacles, and people are getting mad at you because maybe you don't speak the language very well, or you have an accent, or, you know, you're sticking to your customs and stuff. It's very hard. It's a very hard thing to do, to leave home. I say that as somebody who left home at 17. It's really hard, and a lot of people who haven't experienced it have a hard time understanding how challenging it really is. So yeah, anyway, what I just wanted to say about that was that, yes, I wish we would have seen a bit more of an exploration of her journey through really understanding her mental health and getting better and opening up and realizing that, you know, mental health isn't just a white people thing. On the other hand, we have Blaqe. So Blaqe's situation is interesting because it's more implied than it is, you know, we don't get straight up told this, you know, you never have a moment in which we see Blaqe outright saying, oh, this is why I tried to commit suicide. But we do see, you know, he moved with his mother to a very, very, very white area. And as somebody who has moved to very, very white areas for my entire life outside of my country, it can be very hard. It's a lot easier when you are white passing as I am, but it can be very hard for people who aren't. And when we see Blaqe interacting with his friends, or when he's even just talking about school, you know, he talks about how, like, oh, people will mention drugs and they'll look at him, and even his friends just kind of treat him more like a caricature of this exotic person in town, as opposed to treating him as, you know, an actual human being. And it's of course frustrating for him, and he doesn't really feel connected to Nigeria because he left as a child, and he doesn't really know who his father is. So it seems that a lot of what pushed Blaqe to the edge was just not having a clear sense of identity, not being able to say, okay, this is where I'm from and this is who I am. With him, as well as with Ifemelu, I really, really, really wished we would have gotten a bit more of an in-depth look into his recovery process, just because we kind of have him telling Ifemelu that he'll be okay, and that she can go back to Nigeria, but they don't really ever just outright address it. And, you know, obviously it's a really hard thing to talk about, and again, I know it wasn't the core message of the novel, the core plot or anything, so I understand why it wasn't addressed. But yeah, it would have been something interesting to sort of see them maybe be able to have that bonding moment and be like, hey, yeah, we are Nigerians and you are like an African person living in America, so you're a bit more Americanized, but we can talk about this and we can normalize it. So it would have just been nice to kind of have that little moment just to show the reader that, hey, it is okay to go through this stuff. And the last point I want to talk about is just relationships. Basically just Ifemelu's relationship with the men in her life. Well, the romantic interest, I should say. Because Dike is awesome. I think her dad is a pretty strong-willed and interesting guy as well. But her relationships are all across the board problematic, and I was not a fan of them. So let's start with Kurt. So with Kurt was her only white boyfriend, and their relationship was honestly probably the healthiest out of all of her relationships, which isn't, you know, it's not saying that it was perfect, but they seemed to get on really well. He seemed to, you know, he was close with Dike. He seemed to really care about her. I don't know, there just seemed to be a lot of harmony there, but I also understand that, you know, with him not being Black, with him coming from a lot of money, there were just things from her life that he just wasn't going to be able to understand, which is kind of what led her to sort of end that relationship. It was just kind of realizing that there were just things that he was never going to understand why they were such a big deal to her. And other times he was going to take things almost too personally on her behalf when he didn't really need to, because it wasn't a big deal for her. So it's interesting then seeing that compared to the argument she ends up having with Blaqe, because it is basically her then not understanding why something is such a big deal to him. So it's interesting to just kind of, I'm just thinking out loud now. I hadn't thought about that until now. So yeah, it's interesting to see that what ended one of her relationships also ended the other. But yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this. I was just saying I think Kurt was her healthiest relationship, but I understand why it ended, because at the end of the day, you know, she was always going to be looked at weird in his social circle. He was never going to fully understand what, you know, her life was like. There were always just going to be disagreements and issues that he wasn't going to be able to understand. But even at the end, when she reaches out to him and they kind of make up, a part of me was really hoping they'd end up together, and I was kind of sad that they didn't. But that brings us to Blaqe. So Blaqe is, to me, a bundle of red flags. Less than Obinze, but still a bundle of red flags. So he flirts with her on the train when they first meet, and then he ghosts her because he was in a relationship. While I appreciate the fact that, you know, he wasn't about to cheat on his partner, he still flirted with her, and he's a grown-ass adult who could have just been straight up with her and been like, hey, I'm in a relationship, so we can be friends, but that's about it. Or even just be like, yeah, so we can't talk. Whatever, you know. I just think it was kind of rude of him to just ghost. He was very set in his ways, and at times he came off as a bit patronizing. Like he didn't understand why Ifemelu viewed America differently from him. And, you know, when they agreed, it was great, but when they didn't agree, it wasn't that great. And we'll see that again when I finally talk about my feelings towards Obinze. Yeah, I think the reason really why I think their relationship was doomed to end was because he cared more about being right than about sort of understanding her point of view and understanding that the things that mattered to him, or the things that were a big deal to him as an African American, weren't always going to translate to her experience as an African in America. And yeah, I understand, of course, that it was a big deal to him that she didn't show up at the like event protest thing he was having because of like profiling and stuff. But I think it could have been something that they talked about, and instead he literally just started ignoring her until like the Obama campaign picks up, and then that's what brings them together. I didn't understand why their relationship didn't just end then and there, when, you know, it's clearly stated that they didn't talk to each other. They were just kind of like cordial to each other, but there wasn't really a relationship. They were more just roommates putting up with each other at that point until the Obama thing happens, and then they're talking again. So yeah, I think that relationship should have ended way earlier. Last but not least, we get to Obinze finally. So I like him in the, when he was young and in the time he spent in London, I liked him, and then I didn't. Then I thought he was very problematic. But really then thinking about it and putting everything together, he was always slightly problematic. You know, he meets Ifemelu on a day that he's supposed to be meeting her friend and start courting her. But then he ends up falling in love with her immediately. But I mean, whatever, you know, they were teenagers. I get it. It happens. It's not like he was with somebody else. It's not like he was betrothed or anything. So yeah, that happened. He did have, as with Blaqe, kind of these moments of being patronizing, in that Ifemelu would express the things that she was interested in, and he'd kind of just put them down and be like, no, you should read this instead, or you should be like this instead. And yeah, he always just wanted to be right, and he always wanted to put off this air of superiority, which wasn't a vibe. Yeah, other than that, you know, I think there were a lot of problems in the way that they communicated with each other. It was obvious that they were always hiding stuff from each other. But what really got to me, and I saw it coming, I knew they were gonna kind of like have that will they won't they thing going on, but he was married, and yeah, okay, he does do the right thing by getting a divorce, but he'd already engaged in a relationship with Ifemelu while he was still married. Yes, it bothered me that he kind of like went behind his wife's back, and it bothered me that he wanted to basically have his cake and eat it too. You know, he wanted to keep Ifemelu around, but he also didn't want to get a divorce because of a sense of duty, and he admits that he married his wife just because of that, and he kind of sometimes slights his wife in front of Ifemelu, which bothers her, which makes sense. You know, I'd be like, oh, okay, you're gonna bring your wife down, but you still married her while you're trying to court me again, so, you know, what's the story there? But what really bothered me about this relationship was that, to me, it didn't make sense for her to get involved with him while he was married. Because in the entire book, you know, since she was young and she was aware that her aunt was in a relationship with a married man, she was always very critical of that. She did not approve of her aunt's relationship with the general. And after that, when she goes back to Nigeria, she doesn't approve of Ranji's relationship with another married man. And yeah, she wasn't using him for money, but I think with somebody who was so like set in, she was very opinionated, and somebody who spent so much of the book talking about how that was not her thing, for her to go and probably end up with him, it just felt very out of character. And I don't know, I kept hoping that she would find a relationship that was healthy and where she was valued. And I don't think that Obinze loved her. I think he was obsessed with that idea of like, oh, she was my first love and we just thought we were gonna end up together, so it'd be great if we did. But yeah, he still had that patronizing air, and I just I don't know. I just wish that we would have seen her explore a relationship with somebody who wasn't taken and who wasn't causing her all this emotional strife. So what's it all about? Well, at its core, Americanah is a book from the perspective of a non-American of America under a microscope. It's a story about the shedding of culture and identity that is expected of so many immigrants in this country in order for them to be accepted into American society. It's also a tale of the toll that life can take on so many of us and the impact those we love can have on our lives. Thank you guys so much for watching. make sure you leave a like and you let me know in the comments what your opinions and thoughts are on this book and on my analysis. Also, make sure to subscribe for more videos like these and hit that notification bell so you know exactly when I upload every Wednesday and Sunday, and I will see you guys next time.